Welcome to Your Places or Mine with me, John Goodall, the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Aslett, publisher of Triglyph Books.
The idea of this podcast is to try and distill some of the ideas that Clive and I have while we're travelling around the country, which we do pretty much all the time, and I hope they're of interest to more than just Clive and I. But we have wonderful discussions about buildings, and we see things in strange orders and in strange contexts, and it's wonderful. It's very thought provoking, and we hope that this.
We have a lot of fun.
Indeed, we have a lot of fun. We hope this podcast is one way of bringing that to life for other people. And so today, Clive, what are we going to talk about?
We're going to talk about the National Gallery because we are very much on trend. This is the building of the moment, I think.
It is, with the reopening of its bicentenary reopening, yes, and the rehang. And we thought we would try and divide the podcast, because it falls into two parts. We would look, first of all, at the history of the building and then talk a little bit about what's happened to the building most recently.
Yes.
I'm sure it's something a lot of listeners have visited recently, and if they haven't, they should certainly try and get there soon, because it's really, really splendid.
It's one of the best things that's happened in London, I think, for ages.
It is, but yes, the history. It is a really fascinating institution, and the circumstances of its creation, and why it is in Trafalgar Square. I mean, yes, Clive, why don't you just sort of kick off and try and set the scene a little bit? Regency London.
Yes. Well, it's in Trafalgar Square because there were some stables there, and it was a part of London that hadn't been developed from that point of view, because the stables had belonged, I suppose, to St James's Palace, or was it to Whitehall Palace?
I suppose they're just the Royal Mews. It's the Royal Mews, isn't it? And rebuilt by Kent in the
William Kent in the
1730s.
In the 1730s. So, time had moved on, and towards the end of the 18th century, actually, it wasn't a terribly old building, but it had become redundant and wasn't needed anymore. And I dare say it was probably all sorts of nefarious things were no doubt happening, because when buildings get deserted, that's generally the case.
I think, in fact, it is still. I think the Royal Mews actually moves out in the 1820s finally. But
is that?
Yes, I was going to say,
because it was because all the focus was now on Kensington.
Yes, I suppose that is true, but it's also, I suppose, the story of the National Gallery in a way is also one of London trying to acquire the trappings of an imperial capital.
Yes, it was sort of lagging behind as ever,
exactly.
Which was rather a sort of it's a leitmotif of London history, that it was always lagging behind other capitals.
But at this critical moment where Britain is emerging as the first power in the world. And
yes.
and it is, in fact, the situation of the National Gallery, the idea of Trafalgar Square comes from Nash, doesn't it? It's part of his design for the reordering of the centre of London as an imperial capital. And
yes, it was clearly, this very important space right in the centre. And this is actually where, I don't quite know from when, but the measurements of distance to London are taken from the statue of King Charles I.
Oh, the equestrian.
At the top of Whitehall. Yes, that was the place from which the measurements were taken. So it is literally the very centre of London. And of course, that statue itself has got this extraordinary history.
Yes,
statue
indeed.
By Le Sueur, French sculptor, and he made it for somebody like the Duke of Buckingham, wasn't there? Anyway, he was an aristocrat.
And before the Civil War.
And then, of course, when the Civil War happened, and images of Charles I were no longer the flavour of the month, a brazier took it and hid it, and he buried it in his garden, and he got it because
you couldn't bury that, surely, really?
Yes. I'm surprised this is true. I know for a fact, John. And he had to make a lot of sort of all-night bangings, and fires were being lit and everything, because he was telling the parliamentary troops, the authorities, that he was breaking it down into scrap. But he hadn't. He buried it in his garden. And when Charles II came back, it was unearthed.
And re-erected on its
re-erected. So this loyal man had been responsible for saving that actually very beautiful statue. Isn't that a wonderful story?
That is a rather incredible story.
I might have made it up, but...
Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
But anyway, that was That was why it wasn't there originally, but it must have been put there. I think probably at the top of Whitehall, just after the Restoration. I think.
But I mean, it is an area. That streetscape has changed so much, hasn't it, over time? Because you do have. I mean, historically,
I can't really visualise it as what the Mews was like.
Well, the Mews is actually, I think I'm right in saying, slightly further back, and of course there isn't a proper. I think, in fact, this Charing Cross, which is the original sort of nodal point between the Strand and what's King Street, I think it's called, which runs down towards Westminster Palace and then through Whitehall. I get confused with the topography, but it is actually very complicated because basically what you see now is Nash's Trafalgar Square as a cleared space of the early 19th century, but then also Whitehall, where the breadth of the palace courtyard has been driven right down the street to Parliament Square. So, in fact, the equestrian statue of Charles I now sort of sits in a very exposed and prominent site, but previously there was a great deal more confusion, and of course you had
nobody ever notices
that. And also you have Admiralty Arch, which is opened up in the early 20th century, giving a direct access to Buckingham Palace.
Well, that was really the imperial moment, I would say.
Well, there are two imperial moments, aren't there? Because it's Nash first as an imperial moment, and then it is Blomfield's.
We haven't done so well with the Empire, one has to remember. Just for the sake of our American readers, something gone badly wrong in 1776.
But I mean, it's Nash's. Nash has this idea of creating what becomes Trafalgar Square, which is of course connected to Waterloo Place. Again, this.
Well, of course, the theme was that we'd just beaten the French in a big way,
and we were, with George IV as persuading himself he's the greatest king in the world, but
of course, a great building king, wasn't he?
But it is also interesting that England's kings, as well as being monarchs of this enormously powerful mercantile and imperial nation, are absolutely useless when it comes to collecting. I mean, George IV is obsessed by art, but there is no great royal collection in England, and the only point of connection with the arts that the monarchs have is the Royal Academy. And when Nash designed Trafalgar Square, he creates what he calls the finest building site in England. But he's not actually talking about the Nash Academy.
Yes.
He's talking about building a building in the middle of Trafalgar Square in the form of the Parthenon, which is going to be the base for the Royal Academy. In other words, putting the king and the royal connections with the arts centre stage in this square.
Yes.
Now that, of course, never happens.
Well, of course, it's very interesting because in other countries, the king had been able to put his collection, because they had one, on show to the public, and that had started to happen in Vienna and
Dresden
Berlin and everywhere, and obviously in the Louvre. Whereas I'm not king anymore, but it couldn't happen because we didn't really have one.
We sold it off partly.
Partly
sold it off.
Charles I had he of the statue had this fabulous collection, obviously, but it had gone.
But it is this. So
some of it brought back for Charles II.
Indeed, and there are things brought back. But this moment, as you were saying,
so, I mean, it was very typical of England that this the whole National Gallery project was a sort of free enterprise one, essentially,
and it's catching up. I mean, it's the British Museum.
We've done well with the British Museum, haven't we?
But we're from the rebuilding of it again is Smirke's rebuilding of it. I can't remember, begins about 1820. And there isn't a national collection until the purchase of paintings, until the purchase from this merchant Angerstein of a national collection. So again, it's sort of the British trying to catch up with what's going on in other major European capitals.
Of course, it's fascinating that there had already been a gallery that was open because one had been assembled for the King of Poland, wasn't it, Stanislas? But he'd been deposed. So that was then left, in a rather complicated story, but it was then kind of invested in Dulwich College, the school. And that became the Dulwich Picture Gallery, designed by Soane. We should have a series on Soane. But in this context, it's important because that collection now, through a complicated route, got to Dulwich College. It was opened in 1810, roughly the sort of period. But that's a private thing. Well, both the two guys who were responsible for assembling it. So Francis Bourgeois and Desenfants, they're buried there.
Which is
right in the middle of the gallery.
Which is such a peculiar thing, is
Such
having
a
a
peculiar
mausoleum.
thing.
But it is interesting that until this moment, all the major collections in London, I mean, we think of the Soane Museum on Lincoln's Inn Fields, but I mean, there are also things such as the Townley collection, which is on what we now know as Queen Anne's Gate, which is this great collection of classical sculpture, which is a must-see thing in late 18th century London. People, visit, see it. The building still survives, but the contents were actually sold to the British Museum. These are all kind of private house museums. Soane, of course, fossilises his creation by establishing his museum in perpetuity, but all these cultural institutions are private. And again, the king, it takes a back seat. But this is what Nash's vision is, that the one point of connection that the ancient kings have with the world of the arts is the Royal Academy. So that is going to be the central building of what becomes Trafalgar Square.
I think the other point we should make about Trafalgar Square, because it was the royal muse, but also, and this is very important in the story, really, there was St Martin in the Fields, the church by James Gibbs, a very influential building. It had enormous... Gibbs produced pattern books, and they were very influential in North America. And so the model of St Martin in the Fields, with a big portico and a tower over it, a steeple, was taken up in lots of American towns.
And in India too. In Calcutta.
Yes. So it's an almost important building, but it wasn't. I mean, we now think of it as being part of displayed on Trafalgar Square, but there was no square.
And interestingly, by popular demand, the present frontage of the National Gallery is actually reordered by Wilkins when he builds the present building, in order to accommodate the St Martin in the Fields within the vista, looking down Pall Mall. So, in fact, fascinatingly, even in the early 19th century, the planning of the building is affected by public interest in St Martin in the Fields and giving it clear...
It's a great masterpiece.
It is a great masterpiece.
But, of course, it had this effect. David Watkin, the late David Watkin, professor of history of architecture, used to say that this was a great moment of the picturesque, but it meant that... Wilkins's building, instead of, the view that was highly regarded, was the one along the side. I mean, sort of oblique, not the frontal one.
Well, indeed, because you can see that before you have that broad street going down to Whitehall, this isn't the most important approach to it. Is in fact along Pall Mall and down from Regent Street. So it is in fact that angled view.
Hadn't actually been been cleared. So
and it doesn't. And
it's very odd. It's difficult to think of it now.
Well, it's also interesting because what actually happens, of course, is the National Gallery first opens on whatever it is, the 10th of May in 1825 in Angerstein's house.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
On Pall Mall.
Yes.
But there's then this problem because it's
clearly unsatisfactory.
It's clearly unsatisfactory very quickly, and they need to build a new building for this national collection. But where's the money going to come from? Well, the answer is government funds. And of course, you involve the government, then as now, it immediately becomes enormously complicated. And everybody puts in plans for, initially, the Royal Academy and the National Gallery in one building. And it's all far too expensive. And Wilkins cuts the Gordian knot by coming forward with promising, I think the sums of money are right, but promising to build this new building for £41,000, which is absolute cut price. Incidentally, it's important to remember that it actually cost at least twice that sum of money when actually constructed.
That's a surprise.
That's a surprise. But the government is thrilled to have this cut price offer, and immediately goes with Wilkins, who, of course, has already at this point has quite an impressive experience of building.
Yes, we should say something about Wilkins, really.
Just go on.
Well, it doesn't have to be me, John.
His name is Wilkins.
Well, he is a very interesting figure. He was born in 1778, and there's another William Wilkins who was his father, who was an architect in Norwich, which is where Wilkins was born. He didn't actually, I don't think he's remembered particularly, but he had antiquarian interests. I mean, he must have been an interesting man. And he must have done quite well. Well, Wilkins went to a grammar school, but then he went to Cambridge, and he was very brilliant at maths. He was 6th Wrangler, which means you were the 6th best I think. Doesn't it mean that you're the sixth best mathematician in the university?
Gosh,
Anyway, he was a very good mathematician. Say no more than that. And
I'm good at wrangling, but I'm useless at maths. I don't know what to...
But he won a scholarship to travel, and he set off.
That's right. Oh.
I mean, although his subject was maths, he was very interested in architecture. Well, obviously through his father.
And he's drawing for his father, isn't he? Doesn't he draw lots of Cambridge buildings that are engraved? I have a funny...
a very... I didn't know.
I can't...
Very likely, but he was being sort of simultaneously educated in architecture by his dad. And so off he goes to, I think he travelled quite widely, Greece, Italy, but also
right.
Asia Minor, because he was slightly the second wave of those travellers. I mean, really people who were interested in the Greek revival, which means that previously the Grand Tour had stopped at Rome, and everybody thought that Rome was the centre of culture and civilization. But then it was pointed out that actually Rome had borrowed a lot of things from Greece. And so if you wanted to go back to the very origin of classicism, you had to go to Greece. This was not accepted by people like Piranesi to begin with, who strongly argued that they got it all completely wrong and the real origin was the Etruscans. But anyway, he was poo-pooed pretty much. And English architects like Stewart and Revet went and made...
In the late 18th century.
In the late 18th century. They went to Athens, and that was quite a walk on the wild side. But Wilkins was going beyond Athens. I think the Antiquities of Athens was published in the 1770s, something like that. And so Wilkins's travels were after, I think they're 1804, that kind of time.
Which is, of course, an interesting moment in this part of the world, Napoleonic Wars and all these things.
Very much, yes.
And he comes, if my memory is, he comes back, doesn't he? And he immediately manages to get himself the commission of building Heytesbury for the East India Company. The school, the college where East India Company servants are going to be trained to govern India. And he immediately gets this Plum Commission, which is a hugely impressive building.
He was doing a lot because he came back. In absentia, he'd been elected a fellow of his college. Yes. And he came back and he became the master of the Perth School. So I suppose he had that educational connection with
Haileybury. Haileybury. Sorry, not Heytesbury. Sorry, it's Haileybury. Sorry,
confusing me, John.
No.
Haileybury.
No, indeed. Sorry, my fault. I didn't know why that came out. No, it's... go on, yes.
No, I think I said it.
Yes.
Well, anyway, he then... he was really a sort of Greek revivalist. He had to leave his college because he got married. Which, of course, you had to in those days.
But he then, doesn't he... Am I getting this wrong? He goes on and he's then involved in UCL, isn't he? Is that right?
Yes, that is absolutely right. And also country houses like the Grange, this wonderful house which is now... there was an attempt to demolish it, but that was halted by a great conservation outcry in the 1970s, I suppose. And it's now the Opera House, the Grange Park Opera House. But he was the one who started that. It's it's an intentionally romantic house now, but it was actually extended by Cockerell, so maybe...
There's also, a little... It's a mixture of things.
Yes. I mean, Wilkins, he doesn't have a very big fan club, does he, John?
No, well, it's hard to... even today, I'm fond of the National Gallery, but it's as a building, but it feels it's sort of a front, and it's not a particularly moving building. It's just quite sort of grand, and it's very sprawling.
It's quite delicate. The other thing, which is unexpected about Wilkins, who was this Greek revivalist and done all this travelling and everything, he could actually turn his hand, and maybe again this was his father's antiquarianism, to other things, because he did a screen for King's College Chapel in his old university, which is really rather a good effort in sort of late Gothic.
But the screen that's the college screen, isn't it? It's facing the streets. It's not inside the chapel.
Oh no, sorry, no. It's a screen which separates the college from Trumpington Street or King's Parade.
King's Parade,
fact, yes. But it's in this sort of perpendicular. To match the chapel.
Yes, I think. Really? Well, that is very clearly, I think, matching the chapel.
But he did do other things. I think he did a few country houses and things in a Gothic style. So he was. Well, this was a thing that was a very Regency taste, wasn't it? That you could move from one to another. And people wanted richness and variety.
And in this case, of course, with the National Gallery, which is important to emphasise, it is originally the Royal Academy and the National Gallery. He's basically fishing for a commission from the government.
Yes.
And so putting in this cut price bid, which of course is totally unrealistic. And he creates, in effect, a very long and ungainly building, which is meant to have this central staircase that takes you in. And I think I'm right in saying you turn left and you were going to go into the National Gallery, and you turn right and you were going to go into the Royal Academy. And of course, the Royal Academy had previously been in Somerset House, and it moves from there into the National Gallery for a period, and then will move on to its present home in Burlington House on Piccadilly. So this is a sort of intermediary stage. And the demands of both buildings are very unusual, because you need large areas of wall space to hang the paintings in both cases, and so you're already dealing with a building that's actually quite unusual in form. You don't want lots of windows.
Yes.
You want top lighting.
Yes.
And I've never managed to reconcile myself to the dome over over the National Gallery,
Yes.
which seems so clunky, almost beyond
It's
belief.
usually referred to as being a Greek building.
But it isn't.
But it isn't really. I mean, there weren't any domes in Greek architecture, although it has, are they called transeni?
Oh,
These
you're
crisscross.
so clever.
Well, I'm not quite sure I'm right.
You're Wrangler number one of the architectural world.
But there's crisscross things in the windows, which I think were a Greek detail. But there are not many other Greek details. And the other rather fascinating thing is that but you'll know this, John, where the portico comes from.
From Carlton House.
Carlton House, which was it was the Prince Regent's, as he then was, and it was then demolished after he got to Buckingham Palace. But he had this, great, splendid palace overlooking St James's Park, at the bottom of what is now Waterloo Place.
That's exactly it. It was exactly, and this again brings us back to Nash and his plan of 1813 for the redesign of London. That you get Regent Street coming down from Regent's Park, crashing straight through the West End, and it comes down to Waterloo Place, which is where that street intersects with Pall Mall.
Yes.
And then it's going to curve round and come to Trafalgar Square, and then so effectively Pall Mall becomes a street of public buildings. And previously, Regent Street had come down and come to the Prince Regent's house, Carlton House, his palace at the bottom of it. So that's the approach to Carlton House. But then when that comes down and the Prince Regent, as George IV moves to Buckingham Palace, that becomes the square where you now have the Army and Navy Club and the Athenaeum as great public buildings facing what would have been the site of that palace. And the staircase goes into the Army and Navy Club from Carlton House, and all these fragments and the portico go to the National Gallery. So it's a great London building where all its elements are being recycled.
Well, in a very short time, because it could only have been, it was barely been finished. I mean, George IV was such a, he loved all this show and spectacle and decoration and rich furniture, but he was doing it all the time, and he barely finished it. It was finished by Henry Holland. I can't quite remember what date, but anyway, it was just knocked down straight away.
And I actually stumbled across. I was in the library at Windsor Castle, and I was looking at a drawing of published as an engraving in 1811 of the conservatory in Carlton House, and unbelievably, it is basically a miniature model of parts of Henry VII's chapel with this incredible vaulting, and you can
Probably in plaster.
Well, it isn't. That's what's so extraordinary, because I'd seen the engravings of this view before, and I just looked at it and thought, that's an odd conservatory. But in fact, you can quite clearly see in the watercolour that between all the ribs of the vaults, there's light. It must have been in iron or wood.
Oh, I see. Oh, yes.
I mean, it's an unbelievable
interior,
but again, in complete contrast to the classical exterior, which is being recycled.
I mean, he was good on decoration.
Yes.
Less good on cost control.
Because cost control doesn't exist for George IV, does he? As Nash discovers ultimately to his cost. But,
yes. But it's extraordinary. So that great sweep that John was just describing, well, that's a good subject for another episode.
In the future.
It ends in it goes from one park, Regent's Park, and ends in another park. So it's
a fascinating thing. Yes, and as we say, this is
very un-French.
And in a way, this underscores the reason why the main frontage of the National Gallery is not actually the thing that they're thinking about. That you're actually coming to it as an angle, which you can still appreciate. And in fact, in fairness, having been rather down about the frontage, the problem with the frontage is it's simply too broad. But when you come from a side...
No, that's absolutely true.
In fact, it's rather satisfying because all those little edicules and things, they stack up from the side, and they're rather
pro Wilkins than many people
are. Your discernment is doubtful.
But it's interesting that for the columns of the portico, they didn't take the shafts, they took the bases and the capitals, but the shafts were already too rotten. They were just stored somewhere. But isn't that funny? That was such a short time. How?
Yes. Well, I mean, the claim
Perhaps
is...
it did not taken down very well.
Well, I mean, they also, of course, one of the justifications for taking down Carlton House is that it's structurally failing. But I mean, it seems very hard to believe with something that had been built with such extravagance. So soon before.
But the point of the columns is really that they illustrate that they were saving money whereas they possibly could.
It's true.
Because it was a government commission.
It's also important, isn't it, to say that what we now see as the frontage of the National Gallery, in fact, you could walk through it at 2 points. That there are these openings that run through, and I seem to remember it's at a barracks block and also something else behind. And
there was a barracks and something else.
And you can still see this when you go inside. I mean, basically, you've got the central portico with the steps, which is now obviously no longer functions because it's got the new entrance. But then on either side, there are sort of smaller edicules, and those actually were passages leading through from Trafalgar Square to a barracks block behind the building, which is a space now taken up, of course, partly by the gallery, but also partly by the National Portrait Gallery.
But that was a good thing in kind of urbanistic terms, because it's what we now call porous. You could move from one part of the city more easily to another. Which must have been attractive.
Yes, I mean, I suppose it's just so strange because we think, I always think of the National Gallery today as a backdrop to great, protests, national events and all these things. And what's so strange about it is that it is really a screen and a building, but there's so much going on, as you say, you can go through it and pass, and that's something that you don't think of now.
Yes.
You can't pass through the National Gallery. It's a wall running along the whole north side of Trafalgar Square, and previously it's not in that in that form.
No. And of course things, the government was not generous to any cause, including Nelson. And Nelson's column was finished, I don't know, in the 1840s, wasn't it?
Yes,
So very
late,
after
and late 1840s, I think.
I think that's right.
The whole thing. This fascinating thing indeed. You get the government involved. There's enormous sums of money involved, but every penny of that money is sort of extracted, like like a bad tooth from a resentful government.
Yes.
But it is also seen, I think it's important to say, isn't it, that it is seen as part of a national project to create the architectural infrastructure of a great imperial European capital, and that London is this change that takes place in the first decades of the 19th century is really, it's transformative of London in just the same way that the early 20th century is transformative again of London.
I suppose we should say that events in France, of course, we emerged as top nation, to paraphrase.
Yes.
But events in France had been very helpful to the National Gallery because they had released a huge number of paintings which could be acquired
by this country that was priding itself on being the richest, the greatest. There is, I think we've laughed about this before, but I mean the Regency, plutocracy and aristocracy, there really is something quite Trumpian about them. They're incredibly pleased with themselves. They have more money than anybody else. And French things in particular have a self-serving appeal. I mean, you can see it in George IV.
Yes.
That he collects all these French things. He's fascinated by the luxury products of France, and that's partly because he's just defeated.
Yes, but that's true. That's true. But also they were a byword for luxury, weren't they? I mean, as France has always promoted itself, and does today,
as the most elegant and the finest
and the best champagne, and the best,
exactly.
All these luxury goods as well. I mean, they're supported by the state, and I think they still are, and promoted. And France thinks of itself as being a centre of luxury, and it certainly was in the 18th century under the kings. But then this all the aristocratic palaces were thrown open, and so these fantastic pieces of furniture,
and
in particular, and paintings too, were on the market. And
they are acquired with extraordinary rapidity by a
yes.
predominantly English,
yes.
the wealthy in Britain, because they have the money, they have the cash
yes.
at the particular moment in time. Well, listen, we've introduced this, so
yes.
we are now going to take a break, and we're going to come back and talk about
today.
All right. Right, well, here we are.
Here we are again. I hope we had our jingle. Apparently, sometimes the jingle has not been present. It's not been played.
There's no rest for the listener. Yeah. So we sort of plunging on. We finished, the National Gallery opens in 1838, the present building, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think it was Queen Victoria. It must have been one of the very first things she did, because she became Queen of that year. I believe it was she who opened it. So it was just at the very beginning of the Victorian period.
And to emphasise, it's the National Gallery and the Royal Academy when it first opens. It's a very important point.
Okay, I take that, John. These two. But if I can say on behalf of Wilkins, he was. This is a late building for him. He didn't have a very, very long career. He died actually the year afterwards. So I suppose he would have been just over 50. Is that right?
Gosh, I don't know.
He was 78. Oh, no, possibly. No, perhaps he would have been just over 60. I think I might have wrong.
A more respectable
career. He died, let's say. Let's face it.
But I mean, obviously, the whole building becomes the National Gallery, and
the Royal Academy. The Royal Academy goes.
The Royal Academy moves on. But what's fascinating is that, and also the passages through the building are closed off. The whole thing becomes subsumed within the National Gallery. And I mean, the story, I suppose, takes off again in the late 20th century, where we begin to see the building that's resolved.
Well, I suppose
today.
We have to say in the 80s.
Yes.
Sorry, you said the late 20th century. Yes, that is the late 20th century. Yes, in the 1980s, because it's... Well, we've had this story before in a previous episode, but we'll have to paraphrase a bit, won't we, John? Because you can't leave out the carbuncle in the whole history of the National Gallery, because it creates the Sainsbury Wing.
I mean, it's worth saying that internally, also in the interim, I think I just remember this, but you probably do remember it more clearly, that really all the historic interiors of the National Gallery were gradually overwhelmed, weren't they? I mean, there were flat polystyrene ceilings. And
yes, it was absolutely ghastly.
That it was turned into a kind of neutral gallery space
which
internally.
of course, was the look of the time. But it was... the director, Michael Levy, I think it was, and his trustees were desperate to have more display space. But this was in the 1980s, the early 1980s, when there'd been a recession. Mrs. Thatcher was in power, and she was very much against government expenditure of any kind. And so there's very high inflation, and everything was being brought under control for understandable reasons. But it wasn't very good if you wanted more gallery space for the National Gallery. And the plot was hatched to provide this through a partnership with the private sector. And there were going to be offices on the base in the basement, on the bottom half of this building, and then there were going to be galleries.
It was a storehouse, wasn't it? There was on the site of what is now the Sainsbury Wing.
There was a sort of depository. It seems strange that they could have had this very utilitarian sort of warehouse building. And the National Gallery had acquired it in the hope of doing something, but there was no money
to do anything.
And the government wasn't going to put money into it. And they were very worried that if they didn't bring a scheme forward, it was going to be taken away and sold, because that's what was happening to all surplus government-owned land.
Plus ça change.
Yeah, plus ça change. But, I mean, they were, and it was probably the right policy. I mean, the government owned all this stuff and it wasn't doing anything with it. But the board of the National Gallery thought that, well, we must put some sort of scheme forward. And anyway, it was this private-public partnership. And it was a sort of terrible, the whole thing was a terrible bodge. And the firm who did it produced a design that was not which was really pretty terrible. I mean, not entirely their fault, because they were trying to meet really an impossible brief.
Which combined office space with
gallery space. And of course, this was the first time such a thing had been done in this country. And the private developers, who of course were very used to doing this sort of thing, got more and more out of the government, and the gallery got less and less. And it was really all a disaster. And then in 1984, Prince Charles was addressing the 150th anniversary banquet of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and instead of sort of tickling their tummies, said that some pretty awful things were going on. One of them, he particularly singled out the National Gallery, which he said this design was like a monstrous carbuncle on the face of an old and elegant friend, or an elegant and much-loved friend. And that really dished it. Again, a bit unfair to blame the architects who had been sort of doing their best, because it really sank their career for a while. But as a result of his intervention, then Lord Sainsbury and his brother came forward with Lord Rothschild, who became the chair of the trustees. And at that time, the National Gallery was brilliantly restored and put back. The main rooms of the Wilkins period were put back with all their richness and everything. But a new building was built. There was an architectural competition. It was won by an American practice called Venturi Scott Brown.
And this, it's a very interesting building, isn't it? I was, looking at it afresh, and I slightly come to take it for granted. But now that this new work of restoring it that's just been undertaken, now it's taken place, it's really interesting, sort of examining it again. It's a very externally, obviously, it extends beyond Wilkins's frontage, and to which it's linked by a bridge, a recessed bridge that sits behind the frontage of the facade. But what they've tried to do is create a frontage that initially echoes the Wilkins building, but it's as though as you move from right to left, looking along the front of the Venturi Scott Brown extension, the detailing becomes more and more minimal.
Yeah, so it's a bit like the Wilkins building seen through a kaleidoscope.
Yes.
You have the elements, but they're all sort of mixed up.
But it starts very strongly, doesn't it? And
yes, it does. I think it's actually rather brilliant. I think it's very interesting. It was at a period when modernist architecture ruled the roost, and postmodernism was just coming in. And this was saying that, unlike the previous orthodoxy, which was absolutely dominant, which was very austere and said that you couldn't have decoration of any kind on the outside of a building, but the postmodernists were rediscovering in a playful way the joy of making allusions to the past and generally having a bit of fun and bringing a bit of richness and visual delight into architecture, which had been missing for a long time. So this was a building which was done at the sort of beginning of that movement. So, it was too much. These architects couldn't kind of go the whole hog and just do a classical building. They had to do, they like, for example, Lutyens, because he was playful. And, classicism light was the sort of theme. But I think that it's an intellectually very interesting building in its response.
If you look at it again, sort of, you get the corner of the Wilkins building with this sort of cluster of details on the corner of the building, and that's echoed then on the extension, on the facing corner. But then all the detailing, there's even a window recess, it becomes shallower and shallower and less articulate. The cornice goes from being like the Wilkins cornice to being an abstract block at the far left of the building. And there's a window which is just a ghost of a window, half expressed in the wall. It's like ripples, as they're big ripples close to the impact on the surface of the water, and then it dies away as it moves.
Are you liking it, John, or are you finding it a bit difficult?
No, I just was really surprised to look at it again and suddenly realise because I think part of the reason is that the problem with the building when it was first designed was where both the road, which prevented you from sort of standing back, that's long been closed.
Well, I think we should say that, just explain how it was, because Trafalgar Square used to be like an island.
Yeah.
And there was a busy road going around all four sides. And one of the wonderful things that happened, I suppose it must have been in, I don't know, was it in the 90s, something like that, the road on the north side, which separated the National Gallery from the square, was closed.
Yeah.
And so previously, of course, also another thing which has happened is I don't know how many visitors there were, but let's say 1 million in those days. Well, now there are 5 or 6 million visitors. So that's another thing which has changed. But it was a bit like the National Gallery itself, which we were saying is now seen in a different perspective, so to speak, because the Trafalgar Square hadn't been created when it was built. This arrangement with the new part, the Sainsbury Wing, that has also changed. So we see it in a bit of a... We literally approach it in a different way. We sort of wander up to it. There would have been a road. We would have been killed by a bus if you'd done that before.
And also the most recent alterations, I think almost the most important and interesting detail of the recent alterations, which have left the exterior pretty much exactly as it was, is the creation of the forecourt to the Sainsbury Wing, whereas before there was a lawn that with a raised lawn that ran up, and you didn't really get the sense of that area as an entrance space, which it now much more clearly is. You're sort of encouraged by the clearance simply of that lawn. You're sort of with the bridge as a backdrop behind you. You're sort of encouraged to see that as an entrance court, which it never used.
No.
I never really looked at the building that way.
I think it's absolutely brilliant. I was taken around by Annabelle Selldorf, the architect, and the extraordinary thing was, she is so subtle that she was describing all that she'd done, and it looked so absolutely right that I couldn't really remember what had been there before, because these details were kind of insignificant, but by removing them, it's enhanced the experience of the building so much. And actually that permeability, you're now much more invited. I don't know whether you actually could before to walk through. You can. You could, but it's not the original. It's not the original.
But
place,
again, that raised bed, I think, it just sort of changed the feeling of that. Also, one piece of trivia that's rather fascinating is that I can't now remember the details of it, but if you go, there have always been fig trees planted against the front of the National Gallery, completely overlooked. But these are, I think, particularly old fig trees. There's a whole line of fig trees, and you can see them now clearly for the first time. So when you next go back, it's really easy to overlook. But the Wilkins frontage has a line of fig trees growing along the bottom of it, it's really weird. It's a really weird detail, and there's some significance to it which I now, of course, can't quite remember. But it's they are there.
Adam and Eve.
Something of the fig leaf over Wilkins's bill. I don't know.
Of course, I think the Venturi building is brilliant inside.
Just before we go inside, the one other thing to say is that I think it's very unusual what's just happened, because it's always been the problem before that there's a massive portico to the National Gallery, of course, and porticos say in architecture this is the way in. And one of the problems is obviously there are lots of steps going into the building that way, and trying to create something that forms a competing entrance without competing with the portico.
Yes.
The Fitzwilliam, for example, in Cambridge has a similar problem, and it hasn't really resolved it.
No.
The portico still is quite clearly the entrance to that building.
And it was one for a time. It became, again, the entrance, didn't it? And that was marvellous.
And it was marvellous. And so what the National Gallery has had to try and do, I think, is create a rival entrance without actually shouting, screeching at the original portico entrance. And I think, in fact, to a degree that I would have thought was not possible, what has been done does succeed by creating that forecourt space.
I think the reasons for it are threefold. One is that access of people who can't get up the stairs is important. Yes. Two, the volume of visitors now means that you have to have a kind of route, and they can't all come and go to the same space.
Security.
But the other awful thing is that because of these Just Stop Oil people throwing their tins of soup, there had to be so much more security. And that, was part of the issue. Actually, it's brilliantly solved. At least we hope it's solved if it works. Because it used to be that you had to walk through a sort of great big airport-style scanner. But Annabelle Selldorf was saying that technology is now so good that the scanners are very much more... They're like pillars now. They're like small pillars, and extraordinary enough, it scans whole groups of people together. I don't quite know how it does. It must be some AI.
And I've been in
probably reads your mind.
I have to say I've been in twice since the reopening, and on neither occasion have I had to queue. And in complete contrast to the period when the gallery was closed over the last couple of years, where the queues to get in were enormous. I mean, it no longer became
Sometimes
possible.
in the rain.
Yes, you just couldn't queue. It was 20 minutes to get in.
No.
And the British Museums,
of course, the British Museum.
And indeed, I think, well, I mean, it's...
Mind you, we hope it's something similar.
Will happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a whole subject, isn't it? The entrance arrangements for museums today are a massive problem because so much more needs to go on in those entrance spaces, so many more people are there. And it's...
I would say that the National Gallery is a huge hit in this respect. And, of course, it's significant that before the architect had put pencil to paper, if that's what they still do, I think 7 or 8 past presidents of the RIBA wrote to the newspaper objecting to the tinkering with the Venturi building. Of course, they've been left with egg all over their faces because the result is brilliant. It was so rude to Annabelle Selldorf because, after all, they hadn't really seen what she was going to do. And in fact, I think what she's done is absolutely brilliant. Curious enough, because what she has done is...
Let's move inside. We're going
to go inside.
Yes,
we're going to go inside. We're going to walk through. We have got past the scanners. We haven't been stopped. There's no queue. And we go into this... we go into this big open space, which actually was what Venturi Scott Brown designed. Because... I'm not sure whether this is widely known, because I was for some reason told in a rather secretive way by somebody I'd better not name in case it really is a secret. I don't know why it should be a secret. But anyway, the shop, which took up a huge proportion of this space inside, and actually not very many people went into, wasn't designed by Venturi Scott Brown anyway. So, understandably, this is, I can't remember, is it grade 2 or is it grade 1 listed, the Sainsbury Wing, but it's very highly listed. But this
they just
sort of
plonked.
clutter.
They plonked the shop. Yes, when you walked in on the left-hand side, it was a large shop,
and there was a whole lot of clutter, and there was a cloakroom and stuff, and that's all been swept away. So you have this wonderful space, which is so much better because of the large numbers of people milling around.
And the columns...
yes, that was another thing.
They've removed various columns, haven't they? And they've also reduced them in scale.
It was a funny thing. This is a funny thing, which was rather symptomatic of postmodernism. There was a sort of Teletubby quality to it.
The Michelin Man column.
Yes. So these columns, and it's surprising, because the Venturis, because Venturi was married to Scott Brown, were very elegant. But yet they made these columns much fatter than they needed to be. It's really extraordinary. So they've all been put on a diet and slimmed down.
Brutally.
Yes. And some of them have been taken out altogether. So, I mean, it's a much more open and elegant space than it had been before. But it doesn't impact on either the wonderful staircase, which is magnificent, and has always been one of the treats of going to the National Gallery, which rises in one great sweep with a sort of false perspective, doesn't it?
It's a very strange...
It does have a false perspective.
I mean, everything is slightly off-centre, and it's one of the brilliances of the design generally, it seems to me, is that it resolves the fact that the whole Sainsbury Wing is on a slightly different alignment from the Wilkins building.
Yes, of course.
But, I mean, there are other things that are quite interesting. I mean, in a nerdy way, at the ground floor level as well, there's an area of rustication, blocks of stone cut with very deep, thick borders to give a sense of massiveness.
Yes.
And that's a rather wonderful detail. There's a little bit of wall I found myself nerdily photographing when I went back, because it's been Clive is looking appalled. But I thought it was really, really satisfying. And then, as you say, you go up that staircase with one huge, effectively a wall of glass looking towards the Wilkins building, and it rises up to the bridge. What's very odd, there are two things that are odd, and I find disturbing if I stop and look at them, because I love the vista when you look along, up the stairs or down the stairs.
Yes.
But if you look up, all the main braces of the roof of the stair, they don't align with anything. One of them drops down onto the top of a window and things. I mean, it's a really kind of clunky thing. But it is.
Notice that.
That's how unobservant of you, Clive. But the other thing,
I'm just enjoying the experience of going up. It's like it's like something in the Vatican. I mean, this huge stair, and it's so privileged. And you go up, and you've got these galleries which have the stone Pietra which was used because it was for the display of the early Italian paintings, which would have come from Florence and so on. And so this stone, which is very familiar from Florentine churches, was used.
From it's Brunelleschi's Santo Spirito in Florence, isn't it? But
and it's very interesting that Gabriele Finaldi, the director, said that when he did when all these things were taking place, he didn't want to change his galleries at all because they were perfect.
Indeed.
Which I think is true. I think they're wonderful still.
Though what they've done also, which I think is a great improvement, is they have changed the colour scheme inside, because in fact there are now darker shades on some of the walls than before. I mean, it seems
but the stone structure.
The stone structure is the same, and
the door cases.
And it's really clever, isn't it? Because that shift in axis is concealed by turning the corners of the main framing axial arches into columns, so you don't read them as hard edges, and you can't see their alignment. So when you stand in the Wilkins building and look back over the bridge, you seem to see a building on axis, but in fact that's done by these rather clever openings which are articulated in the sides by columns.
That's very like Nash. That's very like Nash in Regent Street, where he's got All Souls, Langham Place, at that sort of awkward change in angle, because you see this circular church, and your eyes just sort of deceived.
And it aligns from every angle rather than just one.
Yeah.
But the change, I mean, as finished, I mean, I really admire the interiors of the original Sainsbury Wing, but it did strike me that they really flattered a kind of Florentine Renaissance painting. The gold ground paintings that were in there were killed by these very pale colours.
They're sort of greyish or beigeish.
Well, it's now a much darker grey. I mean, I think that you do need that slightly darker colour to show off the gold ground paintings, because otherwise they sort of die in that Santo Spirito.
I suppose that's
aesthetic.
not really even the architect. I mean, that's a matter of decoration rather than...
It is, though I think in fact it was thoroughly designed, with that colour scheme by Venturi Scott Brown.
But they may not have known exactly what was going to hang on every single wall.
And it's not a criticism. I mean, it's a decision that was taken, and I mean, after all, what's just been done, it's brilliant. But I mean, there will come a time when people see it as something that needs to change too. I mean,
John, you have to tell me, because I'm agog and sitting on the edge of my chair.
I want you to tell me about that. He's not. He's leaning back into his armchair.
Let's spoil it for the listeners, because I saw it just before it opened, and I didn't see the whole rehang. But you've seen that, haven't you?
I have. No,
tell me.
I'm being twice. Well, I think.
Tell us, I should say.
I just think anything that stirs the pot is really wonderful. I mean, there's more on the walls now than before. There are some paintings which, to my shame, I did sort of wonder, gosh, have I noticed that before? It could have been it was in store, but maybe I just looked through it. And I think that the overwhelming sense that I have of having gone round is just the quality. I mean, it's an absolute treasure trove of First Division paintings. Fantastic. And that is something very exciting about seeing
Top Nation once again
represented. And I love that. So the things that strike me about it are the hang of paintings on the axes of the building. So there is this. In the middle of the gallery, if you stand on the bridge, you look one way and there's a Raphael framed in the Sainsbury Wing, and you look the other way and there's Whistlejacket. I mean, Whistlejacket has always been in that place, I think. But it's a hugely long enfilade, but you can see these two, great paintings at opposite ends of the building. And as you walk through the whole gallery, there are really interesting choices of paintings on axes. And
so the hang is very much in concert with the architecture.
I think so. I mean, there are interesting details about the way, there are some, nearly all the paintings have moved in one way or another, and it's really interesting to see them in different configurations. There are definitely some areas where, the ambassadors or the Van Eyck, and what an amazing collection of Van Eycks, that, people tend to gather there. And there are some rooms, I mean, there's the Mantegna triumphs, which were in Hampton Court until recently. And that, curiously, it feels as though that's slightly a corridor room now that people just walk through. So there are areas where people naturally seem to congregate, and then others where, just by the nature of how things are organised, and no doubt, feeling exhausting, seeing so many amazing things that people just pass through. But I mean, ultimately, it is an absolutely extraordinary collection of paintings. It's just the opportunity to see it freshly and differently is an enormous privilege. I mean, and it will change again. Of course, it will.
Yes.
But
this whole project for the bicentenary has clearly been of great service to the collection and has given it a new freshness.
And it reminds us all of how special it is to have these things. I mean, it is easy to take free gallery entry for granted. I don't know, whether it will last, but these are amazing things that we have freely at our disposal, and it's somehow so important to just to be reminded of that sometimes. It's a little bit like the lockdown. The lockdown reminds us that all kinds of things that we took completely for granted were actually really rather special. And I think that the rehanging of this is another way of showing us that something we run the risk of taking for granted is absolutely extraordinary.
How lucky we are.
We are.
Thanks, John.
Excellent.
Thank you for listening. We have a terrific treat for you next week, because we're going to be talking about a vanished palace in Oxfordshire. It was built in the 15th century. It was a thing of wonder, but is now completely gone. At least the palace is completely gone, but there's some of the buildings associated with it, like almshouses and church, and a wonderful monument of the person who built it, or one of the people who built it. She was the Duchess of Suffolk, and she's shown with her effigy laid out in beautiful robes and a skeleton underneath. So this is very exciting, but particularly because this palace in the village of Ewelme in Oxfordshire was the subject of John, or as I should call him, Dr. Goodall's doctoral thesis. So he knows more about it than anybody in the entire world, and I'm sure the conversation is going to be full of insights and absolutely fascinating. So join us next Thursday. In the meantime, do get onto our website, www.ypompod.com. There you can sign up for a newsletter, which will tell you about all the things that we've got planned and other things. Get in touch with us. Tell us what you think. And we hope you can join us next week.